Okay, hello ladies and gentlemen, and thanks very much for joining us today in this special Facebook broadcast from the University of Aberdeen on the occasion of Burns Day. So I'm Chris Crowley, I'm Public Engagement with Research Officer here at the University of Aberdeen, and I'm joined in King's Museum with my colleague Christina Mackenzie.
Yeah, I'm a curatorial assistant here at the University of Aberdeen Museums, focusing on exhibitions, but I do get to do some fun stuff with some objects, as you'll see.
Indeed, so yeah, we have today just a few objects which are from the approximate period of Burns' life and touch upon sort of key themes and ideas that, that were important to Burns and his life and times. So Robert Burns is obviously from Ayrshire, and Robert Burns is the national poet of Scotland, if you like. I don't know whether that's official or unofficial. He's the Ayrshire bard, he's the Ploughman Poet. And today, Thursday 25th of January, every year we celebrate the anniversary of his birth, and tens of hundreds of thousands of people around the world tonight will be eating haggis, reading his poetry, and indeed I think probably raising a glass or two or a quaich or two, but we'll come back to them in a little bit, and enjoying a whisky. So Burns, as we say, from Ayrshire, not from Aberdeen. He certainly visited Aberdeen in his tour of the Highlands, and he kept a journal to accompany his tour of the Highlands. On Sunday the 10th of September 1787 he came to Aberdeen and he met various people here, and he noted in his journal Aberdeen a lazy town. Not entirely sure what we make of that. However, that's not to say that Burns didn't have great respect for, for example, the poets of Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire. So one of the great poets of the 18th century from Aberdeenshire was Reverend John Skinner, who wrote, amongst many other things, Tullochgorum, which I'm sure many of you know. And Robert Burns himself of Tullochgorum said that it was the greatest song ever put down in the Scots language. But one of the other great products of Aberdeenshire and of Speyside and of the area round about is, of which Burns was very well disposed to, is whisky. So, obviously Aberdeenshire today is well known for the distilleries, for the whisky trail, as is indeed is Speyside. So Burns was well acquainted with whisky, he obviously enjoyed whisky. His poetry is littered with references to it. He knew individual distilleries, he knew a lot about it. Maybe perhaps the most famous of his references to whisky is in Tam O'Shanter, when he refers to bold, inspiring John Barleycorn. So John Barleycorn in that sense meaning whisky itself. And of course John Barleycorn is sort of maybe a name for the drink that's more used in America than it is here today, but that's comes from there. He goes on in Tam O'Shanter to say that drinking whisky, as he says, "We ushka beer, we can face the devil." So yeah, so ushka beer, Gaelic, apologies for my pronunciation here, but Gaelic for water of life, and it's one of the many names for whisky. And he's saying there that with whisky you'll have the courage to face the devil. So yeah, the point there is he was a clever man. There was a lot packed into the meaning there, if you like. It's obviously a celebration and maybe a melancholic nod to whisky there. But he wrote about it in many different poems. Another one that he wrote in 1786, Scotch Drink, in which he refers to English brandy, calls it burning trash, I'm afraid. But he also goes on to refer to whisky, which is his muse in it, as a good old Scotch drink. So, Christina, we have a couple of things here relating to whisky that are in the University of Aberdeen's museum collections. It should be said that the museum collections here in the University of Aberdeen are, remarkably important. They're some of the most important collections in Scotland. Sorry, over to you.
They're all
Christina.
recognised as national significance, you're all right. So, first of all, we have this bottle of whisky. This is the only bottle of whisky we have in the collection. It was gifted to the university in 1995 to mark the quincentenary, I should say.
That's of the university.
Of the university, yes. So in 1995, 500 years since its founding. It's a single malt Speyside, but no idea how it tastes because it's a museum object. The next thing we have is this quaich. We have numerous quaichs in the collection of different shapes and sizes. This is quite a small one, and it's most likely as a wedding gift or was used in a wedding. As you can see, the initials on each handle, ED and WR, to probably mark the betrothed. So other than those two, quite a lot of our collections relating to whisky are actually to do with whisky smuggling, which was most prominent in the 18th century when the taxes were so high that a lot of the stills in in Scotland were illegal. So my favourite object in the entire collection has to be this, mainly because it's a flask that holds 2.2 litres of whisky. This was worn by smugglers around their waist, like this, under their clothes as well, to keep it hidden. And I think my favourite part of this object is that you can see there's a large dent in the front of it here, where the smuggler may have encountered someone who wasn't so keen on the smuggling, such as an excise man.
So, yes, Christina, indeed an excise man. So that neatly brings us back to Robert Burns. So Robert Burns, as I'm sure most of us know, was a farmer. He came, from a farming background. He was, of course, also very well educated, and he wrote his poetry. And his poetry provided some income for him early on in his life, but it was never enough, so he always had another job. And initially that other job was as a farmer. And he went through various experiences on different farms, owning them, trying to own them, and they never worked out for him. So by the age of 29, he was wanting to turn his back on that. I mean, that's no real reflection on him. It was always tough to be a farmer, but it was a very tough time to be a farmer at the time of the start of the Industrial Revolution, the Agricultural Revolution, great changes in landowning, medieval patterns falling away. So, it was a difficult time. And he turned to be an excise man. But that was something that he had absolutely no background in, no experience in. And I think it's probably fair to say that in Burns' case, he realised that for getting that job, it was not what you knew, which in this case was nothing, but who you knew. So, he wrote letters to various of his patrons and to the great nobles of Scotland who would be able to influence in his direction. I mean, this is nepotism, if you like. Not if you like, actually, it's nepotism. So, one of the letters he wrote was to the Earl of Glencairn saying, can you get me a preferment, can you get me a position as an excise man? So we don't know specifically which nobleman was involved in this, but he ultimately got a position as an excise man in Dumfries. So that would be the equivalent of HM, Customs and Revenue Officer today. So he got that, it provided him with a stable income. He threw himself into the job so much so that that was 1787, I think, he became an excise man. A few years later, he got a more senior appointment as Customs or Excise Officer for Dumfries, and then in 1792 he was appointed to the Port of Dumfries, where he got an annual salary as an excise man of £50, which is double the average salary of people at that time. So if you take that salary in conjunction with money by that point in his life he was making as a poet, that would have put him for the first time into a comfortable bracket, good comfortable middle class sort of existence and a stable existence. His income as an excise man fluctuated, and indeed, that's maybe a reflection of how he felt as an excise man. It's not a job that would have endeared him to everyone, as we can sort of see at the time, and the issue of excise and duty on whisky was a very prominent thing. I mentioned the poem that he wrote, Scotch Drink, of 1786, and that was a direct response to the Wash Act, which took away tax exemption from the Forbes family and their whisky production. Another poem that he wrote later on was about English introduction of an extra levy or tariff on Scotch whisky being for sale in England, which made it less competitive down there. So, obviously this was something that taxed him, if you pardon the bad pun, there in a number of different directions. So it seems to be that he did throw himself into being an excise man and clearly enjoyed it, and there's a lot of tales about his exploits there. But he also later on wrote a poem in which he says that the devil, ran away with the excise man, that the devil came into town and stole away the excise man. So maybe it was a career that he wasn't entirely comfortable with there as well. But that's because it would have touched upon all of these things. So many people in Scotland who were involved in whisky production, and the excise man would not have been a popular figure. Popular figure with a sword, indeed.
Yeah, well, as you say, they might not have been a popular figure, and this sword might suggest that as the fact they felt they need to disguise the sword.
Right.
So this is disguised as a walking stick. This is the sheath of it. So it would look quite inconspicuous. I suppose that's also because they didn't want to draw attention to themselves as excisemen. But as you say, within that, there is this sword, which is not that large, it's quite it was sharp in its time, it's not sharp now, but it would have done the job, I'm sure. And yeah, I think that's quite common for these. This one's from Aberdeenshire, this one, and it was quite common for them to be disguised as walking sticks like that.
Do we have an approximate date for this sword?
between 1780 and 1810, I'm pretty sure. So late 18th century.
Yeah.
most likely.
So again, you know, within sort of Burns's lifetime,
Yeah,
within the
yeah.
time, you know, when the Scotch Distillery Act put that excise on, or duty on Scotch whisky being
Yeah.
exported down, and you see when the duties were just so high on whisky distilling throughout the country, when, you know, the time of the illicit still was so prevalent up and down the country, and indeed the excise man would have been so prevalent up and down the country. I mean, it must be said, Burns remained an excise man, you know, pretty much for the remainder of his life, which actually by that point was relatively short. He died in 1796. Relatively short his life may have been, but his legacy has been substantial, and you know, so rightly is still celebrated around the world. Actually, just sorry, a surprise question for you, Christine. Why do you think he's caught the attention of so many people?
I would say probably the differences in the breadth of his poetry and his songs. There's a lot of love songs, but there's also, as you say, there's tam shanter. It's a bit more exciting, and it's a bit more, you know, it's not all the same. He had his multiple avenues.
He was the right man for his time in his poetry, sort of hit that note. I suppose the other thing is maybe the diaspora of Scots at the time of the British Empire took that legacy everywhere, but that legacy will only catch on, you're quite right, if that poetry spoke to so many different aspects of people's lives, experience, hopes, loves, fears, and so on.
Definitely.
So, Christina, thanks very much for sharing these objects with us today. So, you know, when you're here in Aberdeen, if you're here in Old Aberdeen, get a chance to come into the University Museum and King's Museum at the end of the High Street. These aren't necessarily always on display, but you know, there's always fantastic displays here from these important collections. But thanks very much for joining us today. Thank you.
Thanks.